Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai, chapter 6, Halacha 6. Today we're going to be talking about when you have partners that want to divide produce that is jointly owned as a partnership, but has not yet been tithed. Now, it's going to come up in this Gemara that we're talking about grain that is still attached to the ground. It has not been cut yet. And that's very similar to what we were looking at in Halacha 4, in chapter 6, Halacha 4, where you have olives on the olive tree. They're hiring a sharecropper to go and pick it, turn it into olives and olive oil, and all the other work hasn't been done by the sharecropper. Somebody else came and planted it and tended the trees. And this really, the Hachamim are saying over there, it's really going to be more like a partnership. And over there, it was talking about, well, can a Goan come along in that kind of arrangement and claim the tithes of the other person? Over here, we're talking about two different partners that perhaps came into a joint partnership through inheritance, or perhaps some other way. So you could have heirs, you could actually have a partnership like a business interest, or you can actually have two different sharecroppers. Now, they basically have it where it's the form of a joint ownership of the produce. And if it's going to be attached to the land, there's going to be a question about whose area is what. We learned over there in a Mishnah and a Gemara in Masechet Peah that two partners are not allowed to just split the field. That there's a problem with it when they both have a ownership interest in the entire field and the entire produce of the field. Why? Because one area of the field over there in Peah, it's saying one area of the field might be more productive, and one other area of the field might be less productive. Or one area of the field might grow better quality product, and the other one grows lower quality product. So then, if you just say, oh, well, this area of your field over there is yours, and this area over here is mine, it's not a true split in a partnership. Let's say you have a partnership of 50-50, and you're saying, oh, well, the area of the field over there is yours, and that, by the way, happens to grow lower quality grain in a smaller quantity, and the half over here is mine. Well, basically, in your possession now, you're going to have something that really belongs to your partner. You really have to have exact splits. It's going to come up where it's going to be okay where you're splitting something that's already been harvested, but the point of this is going to be that it's already attached to the ground. Now, we're going to be dealing with two different segments. One is going to be where it's going to look like you're going to be splitting something that has yet to be tithed, and one person's going to give tithes and one person is not. And the second part is going to be talking about things about Tamei and Tahor. And in all of these cases about things of Tamei and Tahor, why is this in here? Why isn't this in another Seder? Why is this in Zorayim and Demai? Well, because the value of this also has a difference. So the Tamei product is going to be worth less than the Tahor product. So also, we're going to be seeing one person says, oh, well, you take wheat and I'll take barley. You're not allowed to do that because you have dissimilar values. And again, in a partnership, and if it's going to be 50-50, you really have to split it along the lines of the partnership where the partnership is splitting the actual value. And that's kind of the underlying point, is you have to look at the actual value of what's here and split it according to that profit-sharing split. So again, 50-50, you take the actual value, you split it. And if you're doing other things where you're saying like, oh, well, why don't you take the barley and I'll take the wheat, then you didn't really make a real split. If you're making things where you say like, oh, take this area of the field and I'll take this area of the field, you didn't really make a real split because they're going to be dissimilar harvesting areas. And so what will happen is you can end up where one person is actually getting ownership of the other person's interest. We also know this from trees. One half of the tree is going to grow better quality fruit than the other half. Which half is that? It's going to be the eastern side that gets more sunshine. The eastern side is always going to have, on a tree, is always going to have better quality fruit than the western side. So if you just said like, oh, well, why don't you take this half of the tree and I'll take that half of the tree, then you also have a case where you have a dissimilar split in value of a partnership. That's not allowed. The Mishnah says, regarding two people who leased a field in a sharecropping arrangement, or they inherited a field, or they acquired a field together as partners, one of them may say to the other, you take the wheat that is in such and such place, and I will take the wheat that is in such and such place, and you take the wine that is in such and such place, and I will take the wine that is in such and such place. However, he may not say to him, you take the wheat and I take the barley. You take the wine and I take the oil. Now, when they're talking about you taking the wheat in such and such place, they're not talking about wheat that's already attached to the ground. We already covered that in Masechet Peah. And in Masechet Peah, it says if you're making that kind of arrangement where you take the wheat over here and I take the wheat over here, and again, you're trying to settle the partnership split, it's not a real split because, again, the person who has the weaker producing area of the field is going to have ownership in part of the better producing area of the field because they didn't really make a split according to the partnership. So over here, you're talking about wheat that's already been harvested, and they're saying, okay, we have a total amount of wheat over here. Here's the total value of the wheat. It's all the same quality of wheat, and you take this half that's over in this granary, and I take this half in that granary. That's okay, because again, that's talking about the same value. It's talking about something that's already been harvested, and it's talking about something that has the same value, even though it's in two different locations. Now, same would be with wine, but when you're saying to him different quality crops like wheat and barley or wine and oil, you can't do that. Now, even if the produce is still standing, if one partner were to receive his share from one species and the other from the other species, this transaction would be a brera issue. And that's really what's going to be coming up over here. And that's really kind of what the conversation's about. There's a maloket tanayim on whether there is brera and not brera. That's going to be retroactive doing of something. In this case, this is going to be where you had this split of property, of ownership in it, and retroactively, even while it was still standing, if this were the case, you were making an exchange to settle up the equity interest in this joint ownership, and basically brera would be taking the place of it. So you have a number of explanations about this, and one explanation is coming from the Rosh, and I think it's pretty good, where he's saying that if they decide that one will take all of the wheat and the other will take all the barley, it will become impossible to employ brera and to say that each partner received the share that belonged to him from the very beginning. Rather, the division would certainly amount to a trade of one partner's portion of wheat for the other partner's portion of barley. And the problem with this is now when it's standing, it violates the prohibition against selling Tevel. Why? Because it hasn't been tithed yet. You've effectively turned this into a transaction where I have wheat, you have barley. And now you're going to exchange, okay, you take all the wheat, I take all the barley. Well, that's going to be a problem because now you've traded my portion for your portion, and that trade has been where it's been done with Tevel. And this, by the way, is not even talking about whether the two partners can be trusted regarding tithes at all. Perhaps even both of them could be trusted. But what we're talking about in this part is that with regards to doing this part of the tithe, this dissimilar interest over here of exchanging this for that becomes a restriction on a transaction on Tevel. That's what this is trying to teach. So you might say like, oh, well, maybe they're both Haverim, they're both going to tithe it. The problem is that even if they're both going to tithe it and they're both trusted, there's a restriction on selling Tevel. And the Chazan Ish says about this in Shvias 4:16 that the general prohibition against selling Tevel does not apply when partners who are trusted concerning tithes divide jointly held produce, because the division constitutes a situation of necessity, says the Chazan Ish, in which case the rabbis are lenient in allowing the Tevel to be exchanged. And the Chazan Ish points out that only in cases where one of the partners is unreliable does the Mishnah prohibit the exchange of dissimilar species. So according to the Chazan Ish, he's saying that in a case of necessity like this, you have to split up this partnership, right? That's a case of necessity. So you have the grain sitting there, you have to dispose of it, and you have to make the equity split. In this kind of case, they're saying that even if both of them are going to be reliable, you can do this transaction on Tevel, according to the Chazan Ish. And again, the Rosh is saying, no, that's not the case. The Rosh is saying that's not the case. And by the way, the Rosh is coming from an opinion of Rav. Rav has that similar opinion elsewhere. So we can see this over there in Hilchos Meiser 9:13. And over there, they're discussing the Mishnah's ruling, explicitly stating that one of the partners is not trusted regarding tithes. So the Rosh Cirilio is saying that the Mishnah must be referring to even situations in which both of the partners are trusted, and this is really a case about selling Tevel. And that's the point, is that this Mishnah's ruling is prohibiting selling untithed produce to anyone, not just the Am Haaretz, even in this case of a partnership. Okay? And that's going to be part of how the Rosh Cirilio is reading this, and how Rav is understanding this Mishnah. The Chazan Ish, though, is holding that, and this is a case of necessity, and so really the way he's reading it is that you have one case where one is trusted in tithes, one is not trusted in tithes, and the reason that you can't make this exchange where you have one person trusted and one person not, according to the Chazan Ish, is because then you are selling the Tevel. So there's a similar ruling. The Mishnah says regarding a Chaver and an Am Haaretz who inherited the possessions of their father, who was an Am Haaretz. So that's very important. The father is not trusted on tithes. The Mishnah says that the Chaver may sell to the Am Haaretz, or may say to the Am Haaretz brother, and say, you take the wheat that is in such and such place, and I will take the wheat that's in such and such place, and you take the wine that is in such and such place, and I will take the wine that is in such and such place. So in that case, that's going to parallel what we were just talking about. But what's different comes next. It says, however, he may not say to him, you take the wheat and I'll take the barley. You take the wet produce and I take the dry produce. So wet produce is something that has previously come in contact with one of the 7 liquids that can make something susceptible to tumah. And the dry produce is something that's not susceptible to tumah. And so, yes, the father is an Am Haaretz, so it's assumed that whatever wet produce he had, he's already contaminated. Why is that going to be an issue? Well, the value of wet produce is going to be different than dry produce. And Demai produce, you have to assume it's already been Demai because the father's an Am Haaretz. The value of Demai produce is not the same as the value of Tahor produce. The Tahor produce has a higher value. So now you're, again, splitting things up that have, on an inheritance, you have different values. And so again, you need to have the same value. So when they're trying to divide a single species among themselves, like wheat or wine, the share of each one that they receive is going to be regarded as having been his all along. That's going to be due to Brera. And consequently, there's going to be no illegal transfer of Demai produce from the Chaver to the Am Haaretz. And that's kind of what's going on when you're saying like, oh, well, you take the wine over here and I take the wine over there. So again, this now becomes a little bit different reading from the first part of the Mishnah. This is basically assuming that there is Brera, and this is assuming, by the way, Rebbe holds that there is no Beurim, but this Mishnah is written, is going to be written according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who holds that there is Beurim. So, according to this, when they're trying to split this up retroactively, because again, you have this intermingled part, and inside this intermingled part, you have, parts of wine that's his and parts of wine that's yours. And only after you go and you split it, and in this partnership, is it saying like, oh, well, this area retroactively is mine and that area is retroactively is yours. And this intermingling ends because it becomes defined. And so the issue over here is going to be that, well, perhaps you made an illegal transfer of Demai produce from a Chaver to an Am Haaretz. That's what this is getting at. And over here, in the case of the wet or the dry, we know that the wet is already going to be regarded as Demai. And here too, when we're looking at a single species like wheat, the wet and dry are going to be regarded as different varieties. So the principle of Beurim can't be applied because, again, intermingled within it is partly yours, partly mine. And the division, therefore, is going to be considered an exchange of one type for another. And the idea here is that a Chaver is not allowed to transfer to an Am Haaretz produce that is susceptible to Tuma, one, and he may not divide wet against dry. And the Rosh is saying that it would be prohibited for the Chaver to take the wet for himself and give the brother the dry. Why? Because now he's going to make it so that it can become wet, or he won't be able to take care of it right, and it can become Demai. Also, again, the values are not going to be the same. So one way to look at this is going to be like, oh, maybe this is redundant. And, the Mishnah already talked about, somebody who inherited a field together. But Rosh is coming and explaining that the Mishnah's intent here is to extend the previous rule in the case of Tuma. And in the first part of this Mishnah, Tuma was not mentioned. So this actually has a novel ruling regarding the division of inheritance, namely that this Mishnah is teaching that even the Chaver's brother is someone who exercises care with regard to tithes, but is neglectful regarding Tuma. He may not be giving the wet produce in exchange for the dry produce. So maybe the guy is at a level where, he's religious enough where he does the tithes, but he's not learned enough to take care of things to stay in a tahor status. And so the novelty, as the Rosh is pointing out, is that you can't exchange wet for dry, because yes, he'll be doing the tithes, but the novelty of this second part of the Mishnah is now that they're really like dissimilar species, and he's going to make it so that it becomes Demai. And that's what it's trying to teach. The Gemara is going to move along, talk about the rulings in the Mishnah that are based on the principle of Beurim, and that's going to state that when you have jointly owned property and it's going to get divided, the portion of each partner that he's going to receive is retroactively considered to have belonged to him all along. That's what Beurim is, when something is retroactively applied. And again, that's a Maloket Tanayim. So the Gemara says that a Brisa taught if a Jew and a non-Jew purchased a field in Syria together. And that's going to be interesting because, again, Syria is not subject to tithes d'oraita. And also, there's a Maloket on whether it's going to be part of Eretz Yisrael or not. That's a Maloket Tanayim. And we know that a non-Jew anyway is not going to be subject to tithes in Syria, but a Jew is. So that's really what it's saying. So if the grain that grows there is regarded as Tevel and tithe produce, in other words, Hulin, and it's intermingled with each other, these are the words of Rebbe. In other words, Rebbe is saying that, he's basically saying that, each kernel of grain is considered half Tevel and half Hulin, and the ownership is shared by a Jew and a non-Jew. And even after the owners divide the produce, they do not say that the Jew's share is subject to tithes and the non-Jew's is exempt, but rather half of each share remains subject to tithes. Why? Because Rebbe rejects the principle of Beurim. So the Jew is therefore obligated to tithe his share, and likewise, if the Jew buys the non-Jewish share, the buyer is obligated to tithe it. And since only half of each kernel is subject to tithing, there has to be care taken that the amount of tithes is going to be commensurate with the actual amount of tevel that's subject to the obligation. So one way to do this is to separate the tithes from within the produce itself, and that ensures that the truma and meiser are going to be designated in the proper portion. And we covered that earlier, by the way, on how to tithe within itself. And alternatively, one can designate tithes from other produce that's fully tevel in proportion to half of his share that's intermingled in it. So you take tevel that's over here, and then you're going to tithe the new tevel that you just purchased for the tevel that's mixed in, and you're going to treat it as a mixture. And this new tevel that you just purchased is going to fix this intermingled tevel that's mixed in with the non-Jews owned grain. That's basically what Rebbe is saying on this. So the Gemara here is going to continue, and it's going to say, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says the portion of the Jew is subject to tithes, and the portion of the non-Jew is exempt from tithes. And over here, let me explain it. Rebbe is rejecting the principle of brera. He's holding that the division of the harvest does not retroactively clarify which portion of the crop belongs to who at the time that the grain begins to grow. And additionally, each and every kernel is deemed to have been jointly owned. So it's not saying like half of this area is going to be mine and half is going to be yours. Rebbe's coming along and saying, no, in this partnership, there are X number of kernels. There's like 1 million kernels of grain. And each kernel is going to be half owned. So it's not just saying you give 500,000 kernels to partner X and partner Y takes 500,000 kernels. Rebbe's point is saying, no, when they're intermingled, half the kernels, meaning that each and every kernel is half owned. Makes a lot of sense. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying that the principle of brera, which he accepts, is going to be that which, when the Jew and the non-Jew divides the harvest, this division retroactively clarifies which kernel belonged to whom at the time they began to grow. And that basically saying that the Jews' share is going to be entirely subject to tithes, and the non-Jews is not going to be. So over here, he's basically saying, look, after the fact, you've now clarified which kernel belongs to whom, and then you go and you tithe. So the Gemara is going to qualify this dispute, and Rabbi Yassa says in the name of Rabbi Hanina regarding what case do they disagree, and they're going to say where the partners divided the produce of the field while its grain is still standing. So this is really where the maloket is, okay? And the idea is that, when you're talking about grain that's already been harvested, that is going to be easier to split up. But where it's still growing and still attached to the ground, now you're going to have a problem. The Gemara says, but if they divided the grain that had already been harvested and piled into a stack, even Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel agrees with Rebbe that each and every stalk of grain is owned in partnership. In other words, Rabbi Yassa is holding that the dispute between Rebbe and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is going to be only in cases where the partners divided the grain while it's still attached to the ground. And on this case, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is holding that it's reasonable to apply brera to retroactively clarify each partner's original share. And this is going to be where the partners are going to divide the grain after it's been harvested. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel agrees that brera cannot be applied for a grain that's already been mixed together. And all the stalks are therefore going to be viewed as shared property of the two partners, making them half tevel and half hulin. Now, the reason the brera can't be applied over here, says the Meiri, this, by the way, Meiri in Gittin 47b, is going to be that once the grain has already been harvested and mixed together, it's going to be that the ownership of each stalk is going to be derived from the ownership of the land from which it grew. And since multiple stalks can emerge from a single point in the ground, and all of the stalks have already been mixed together, the division of the grain will not necessarily allow us to attribute unique ownership in the land to each partner. And this prevents us from applying brera to any of the grain. By contrast, where the partners divide grain that's still attached to the ground, it is indeed possible to say that the division retroactively clarifies which part of the land belongs to each of the partners. And so over there in Meir, he's discussing how the ownership of the land can retroactively be determined, year after year, even when the division of crops is going to differ from one season to the next. Also, you can see that similar theme in Shvius 16:1. So the Gemara is going to continue with this. The Gemara is going to give another opinion regarding the extent of the dispute between Rebbe and Rabban Shimon and Gamliel. Rabbi Yonah says that Rabbi Yossi relayed in the name of Rabbi Yochanan regarding what do they disagree, where the partners divided the produce of the field while the grain is still standing. But if they divided grain that's already been harvested and bound into sheaves, even Rabban Shimon and Gamliel agrees with Rebbe that each and every stalk is owned in a partnership. So by contrast with what this just said versus what we just learned from Rabbi Yassa is stating that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel agrees with Rebbe in a case where the partners divided grain that had already been stacked. And Rabbi Yonah is asserting that there's an agreement in cases where the partners divided the sheaves over there where it's been created as a big grain stack. Now over here, the implication is that Rabbi Yonah understood Rabbi Yassa as referring specifically to cases of stacked grain. And over here, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel would agree with Rebbe in a case where the partner divided the sheaves of grain that have not yet been stacked, and they're going to go into that. So the Gemara says, accordingly, Rabbi Yonah, what is the difference between the case of Rabbi Yassa, where the partners divided a stack of grain, and the case of Rabbi Yonah, where they divided the sheaves? So again, you take, in the harvesting, we covered this in Masechet Peah, you go and you harvest it into smaller sheaves. You take the sheaves and you make it into big grain stacks. And if you look at Monet's painting on grain stacks, that's what it was. That's how it was done. You stack all these sheaves together, and then you take the giant sheaves, and you transport these giant stacks over to the threshing floor, and that's what you're going to process. So the Gemara is going to be answering that Rabbi Yonah and Rabbi Yassa, in fact, share the same view with regard to cases involving the division of sheaves, and the disagreement is going to be a different situation. So Rabbi Yonah is going to dispute Rabbi Yassa, talking about a case where one reaps every bunch of stalk individually, placing the grain right down in front of him as he reaps. And then the partner is going to divide the grain while each stalk is still in the same place where it grew. And Rabbi Yassa is holding that, in this case, the grain is treated as if it was still attached to the ground, since none of them have moved it from the original place of origin. And Rabbi Yonah, by contrast, is holding that the dispute between Rebbe and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is limited to a case where the partner divided actual standing grain, and in the cases where the partner has divided grain that's already been harvested and cut, even then it's going, even in a place where it already grew, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel would agree with Rebbe that Beur is inapplicable, and so then all the grain is deemed to be a mixture of Tevel and Hulin. And basically, if it's going to be an intermixed ownership of Tevel and Hulin, then you have a case where you have to find a way to tithe it. You can't use Beur to go and fix it retroactively. What you have to do is you have to go get a third stack of produce, and then you have to go tithe this new stack of produce on behalf of the others. What you can't do is use the principle of Beur once it's already been cut, because now you have a mixture of Tevel and Hulin. And what you can't do is just say, well, you take this half and I take this half, and then what we'll do is we'll just, you take out your tithes from yours and I take out my tithes from mine. And in the case of a Jew and non-Jew having ownership like that, that's going to be a case where, you're going to have some of the Tevel mixed in with the Hulin in the Haver's portion. And also over there with the Am Haaretz's portion, you're going to have a mixture where you're going to have definite Tevel and you're going to have a mixture of Demai that's mixed in, because part of it's not going to be rectified. And you're going to have now, again, each kernel is half owned. So over here, where one partner is going to be taking out tithes and the other partner is not, the partner who's the Haver is going to have inside of there, if there's no Brera, he's going to have the Am Haaretz's kernels in there, and that means he has a mixture of Demai, and he could even have Tevel mixed in with it. And you're not allowed to separate that kind of mixture. You have to go get a new pile, and you have to say, okay, for the Demai that's mixed into this, and you have to make an estimate. Let's say it's half. It's half partnership, and you say, okay, I'm tithing on this new stack, and then I'm also going to be tithing for the half that's in that stack as well. Complicated, and it shows how important it is to do business only with Chavarim and to stay out of these transactions with Am Haaretzim. Now, we're going to have another qualification on this dispute between Rebbe and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Rabbi Hoshaya is going to have a different view, and that's going to be, of course, objected to by the students of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Hoshaya says this dispute that is stated is related specifically to where the partners purchased a field with the intention not to divide the produce, and then they changed their mind, and then they ended up dividing the produce. So if the partners purchased the field with the intention to divide the produce, then in that case, even Rebbe agrees with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel that this portion that each partner receives upon dividing the produce is deemed to have been his portion from the very moment it came into existence, due to the principle of Beur. That's a Hiddush. Rabbi Hoshaya is holding like this. He's saying that Rebbe disagrees with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel only because Rebbe holds that when partners acquire a field, their standard intent is to become absolute co-owners of each and every bit of produce. And once this agreement has taken place, the concept of Beur is irrelevant. And in the case where the partners buy a field with the understanding that they will eventually divide the produce between themselves, Rebbe agrees that their share can be retroactively clarified through Beur. So that's going to be the idea, but that's not going to be accepted. So the dissenting view, and then we'll finish up. Rabbi Yossi says like this: the words of some other rabbis are in disagreement with the statement of Rabbi Hoshaya. For Rabbi Abahu, who's a student of Rabbi Yochanan, says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, in the case of brothers who are partners, that's going to be an heir or two heirs that are going to be sharing the father's estate, the status of inheritance that, after they divide it is contingent on this dispute between Rebbe and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Gemara says, regarding these brothers who are partners in the inheritance, they are not destined to divide the property. Of course they are. So basically, Rabbi Abahu is teaching in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that even in this case too, Rebbe rejects the principle of Beur. And we see that, Rabbi Hoshaya's statement is a dispute among the Amorim as well. And let's explain it, and then we'll just finish up. Rabbi Yochanan is referring to a Mishnah that's in Sheklim 1:4, and also in Bechorot 9:3. And the Mishnah is talking about the status of property that is inherited by two brothers, and they're going to come into joint ownership. So one of these laws is going to be the requirement of the Meiser Behema. That's going to be that the owner of a flock of kosher animals has to separate one animal out of 10, bring it to Jerusalem, offer it as a sacrifice at the Bet HaMikdash, and the blood and the sacrificial parts get put onto the altar. The meat is consumed in Jerusalem by the owner and his guest, and this requirement does not apply to a flock that's going to be owned in partnership, but it does apply to a flock that brothers inherit together from the father, but they've not yet divided it. And the Mishnah over there is teaching how that if the brothers divided the flock and later decided to combine their shares to recreate this partnership, then they're like any regular set of partners, and then they're going to be exempt from separating out the Meiser Behema. Rabbi Yochanan is holding that the ruling of this Mishnah is not unanimously held, but is just reflecting the view of Rebbe alone. And according to Rebbe, who's rejecting the principle of Beur, the brothers' division of the flock constitutes an exchange of shares, with each brother having purchased his animals from the other. And when they recombine the assets, it's going to be a completely new partnership, and therefore the flock is going to be exempt from the Meiser Behema. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is going to hold like this. He's going to say that there is brera, and the brothers' division of the flock did not constitute an exchange, but was merely a determination of each one's original share in the state. And thus, when they later combined the shares, they're not forming a new partnership. They just reestablished the undivided estate as it was when the father died. And because of that, there's going to be no reason to exempt the Meiser obligation from them. Now, over here, what this is finishing up to say is that when brothers inherit property from the father, it's clear that from the very beginning, the property will eventually be divided. According to Rabbi Hoshaya's logic, Rebbe ought to agree that in this situation, the concept of brera is applicable. And Rabbi Abahu is saying in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that the case is subject to a disagreement between Rebbe and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, meaning that Rebbe holds that brera does not apply. And so basically, we're seeing that Rabbi Hoshaya's statement is not unanimous. So what we see here is basically that it's going to be like Rabbi Yochanan, by the way. It's basically saying that no matter what, there's still a disagreement between Rebbe and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel on brera. And one side doesn't accede to the other side in the case of brera when we're talking about the partners who have the intention not to divide the produce, and then they're going to come change their mind. And then, basically what they're saying, Rabbi Yochanan is explaining, Rebbe is saying that they're coming and they're forming a new partnership when they do that. And so that's why it's not subject to brera. So again, each interest is basically half-owned, and they're putting it together inside of this new partnership. That's basically what they're saying. So even in this case, Rebbe still rejects the principle of brera, and that's going to be the idea. So have a great day, and we're going to be getting into another topic of an inheritance, and what happens when you have now a convert to a Jew and to be Jewish and not, and they're going to be they're going to be inheriting from the idol worshiping partner. What's going to happen then? Have a great day.